I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question. My guest is Dr. Damien Freeman. Dr. Freeman is a writer, lawyer and philosopher, and presently serves as Fellow of the Robert Menzies Institute, where he's responsible for Institute's Menzies Early Career Network. He's also a Research Fellow at the Kathleen Barrow Research Institute and an Honorary Fellow of the Australian Catholic University, as well as a member of the board of the John Howard Prime Minister Library. Welcome, Damian.
Great to be here.
The reason I'm talking to you is because I've just read this book called The End of Settlement, put out by Connor Court. And in it, you propose a very interesting concept about what a society like ours can do when it seems to have intractable problems and ways forward. It reaches what you call a settlement. Can you explain to me what is a settlement?
Well, by settlement, I mean the idea that we could converge on some way forward that isn't necessarily your ideal or my ideal solution, but we can agree that there's a problem that needs to be addressed in public policy, that there's some great issue that the country needs to address, and we can agree about that. We might not agree about how to address the problem, but we can agree that it would be better that we find a way forward rather than trying to fight to the death. Sometimes you just have to fight to the death, and you have to oppose those who are against you, and it's a war. You know, as they say, in a war, the only justification is total victory. You've got to defeat the enemy. But in a lot of situations, that's not the case, and it would actually be better for us as a society if we could agree to find a way forward rather than fighting on and on and on until we've defeated our opponents. And my suggestion here is, if you look back at our history, we have historically been good at doing this. We've found ways to accept that there's a solution to political problems that may not be your ideal solution or my ideal solution, but we can all come at this in our own way. We can find ways into this, and through a certain measure of ambiguity, I think we can admit enough space that people can find ways into justifying and arguing for things.
And this is different from compromising, isn't it, in your mind?
I think it's different from a compromise. It's the idea that so I think the example we're probably most familiar with is from the 1980s. What happened with the economic reforms?
Okay, let's look at that. By the end of the 70s, there's a problem: high inflation, high unemployment, and the agreements of the way Australia should be run, with high tariff walls, fixed wage setting, and a number of other issues, were seen no longer to be working by some, not by all. And that was agreed as there was by both sides of politics that was a problem, or by most of both sides.
I don't know that it was quite agree. I think we can over-exaggerate the amount of agreement. John Howard, in his recent book, A Sense of Balance, he has a chapter about this, and he says, you know, it wasn't quite as warm and cuddly as historians like to think it was. So the Liberal Party had gone on a philosophical journey from the late 70s into the early 80s, and this was about free market economics. This was very much a rethinking philosophically about what they thought the state should be doing, what they thought their party should be doing, changing from being a conservative party in the sense of being a party that preserved the economic institutions as they were, to being a party that saw the need for reform, and this is because they see that there's a need, there's a change in their understanding of the philosophical role.
Damien, you might say it was a move towards a more liberal understanding of economics and society.
It was indeed. So this is happening in the Liberal Party, But this is not happening in the same way in the Labor Party. The Labor Party hasn't gone on this intellectual journey at all. But the Labor Party finds itself in government, and it finds itself presented with urgent, immediate problems, and it realises that these sorts of liberal reforms are the only way of addressing the problems. So it introduces these measures that begin the process of liberalising the economy and moving towards a free market economy. But my point is, to say there's agreement is sort of to give the impression that everyone had arrived at the same point, but they hadn't really. They saw that we needed to change directions, and everyone could sort of see we needed to move in this direction rather than that direction. But their understanding of why we were doing it and what we were seeking to achieve by doing it was quite different. And I think the right way to understand what happened, and Howe is very clear about this. He's very clear that as Shadow Treasurer, he did not oppose reforms, and he talks about when he could have, for short-term political benefit, opposed government reforms. But he said, what would be the point of that? We knew these were the right reforms. He had wanted to get pushed through some of these as Treasurer and hadn't been able to because Fraser as Prime Minister was too resistant.
He was old school conservative on these matters.
Fraser was, yes. Fraser didn't come on this journey that started under Howard as Treasurer, and he starts to see this, and that there are others in the background who are sort of encouraging this thinking. And of course, the Centre for Independent Studies was central to that, to starting that process. And
but on the Labor side, there's not quite this philosophical change.
No, not at all. And their way of they're doing it because they can see that it's the only way to manage an immediate crisis, and their way of explaining what they're doing, they still believe that their role is to civilise capitalism, and they're now, we now have to accept that we can use the free market to do that rather than try and keep the free market at bay in order to do it. It's a quite different,
much more pragmatic.
They're being pragmatic.
It's all maybe summarised in Paul Keating's famous Banana Republic interview with John Laws one morning, when he said, if we go any further, we'll be a banana republic. I remember hearing that. That was very pragmatic. At the same time, it required courage because many on the left were appalled by these policies. And I remember hearing it, looking back, a great attack on it, not just from the conservative right, but from the other well-meaning, but economically, I suspect.
And so I think part
so was it economic literally? Was it that Keating and Hawke were more literate economically, that they saw this?
Well,
because they grabbed something which others said you shouldn't be using, like
I
floating
think
the dollar.
I think part of what happened, some people within their party had an ideological objection to doing it. That's different. I think they could see that pragmatically, and the advice they were receiving is this is really the only way of addressing the problem. Now, the fact that your party historically has an ideological objection to it, you're going to have to overcome that. But part of doing that is you needed to create the space in which they could tell a story that would bring their side of politics along for the ride. And that was going to be a different story to the story that John Howard was going to tell on the right. And you might find the philosophical journey that Howard goes on more compelling, okay, but people on the left had to go on their own journey. And part of the point that I want to capture with this idea of settlement is we've got to accept that people will have different reasons. At that moment in the 1980s, they need to change direction economically, but we've got to accept that people are going to understand what they're doing in different ways, and people are going to have different aspirations for it. Their ambitions, what they think they can get out of this in the long term, may be different, but it doesn't change the fact that they can all see we're going to have to run with this free market economy.
So they're doing the same thing, but often from very different points of view and different explanation and different reasons.
Indeed,
and that's a settlement.
And I think that is. This is part of this idea of settlement, that we don't we don't need to defeat the people who disagree with us. We could find a way forward that creates enough space that there's a way of moving forward that we don't all completely agree with. John Howard also talks about the health system being an example of this. You know, that he says that the Australian system is halfway between the NHS in England and the situation in America, where it's totally private. And he says, you know, this kind of balancing, he thinks is distinctively Australian. But he also points out, I think in the book, I certainly point out in my book when I talk about it, and I can't remember whether it's my gloss on him or whether it's something he said. But
take the credit. Take the credit.
But you know, the point he says is, look, when there are two ways that you can explain why we should have this sort of mixed health system that we have. You know, one person will emphasise this is important because it provides a safety net for the vulnerable. Another person will say this is important because it creates choice and gives people opportunities to make decisions for themselves. Those are two different ways of justifying why this sort of mixed health system is good. And when it wouldn't be surprising if when Labor gets in, it tends to strengthen the features that are about the safety net. When the Liberals get in, they tend to strengthen the features that are about giving people choice in how they want to arrange their health care. And I mean, it doesn't change the fact that everyone can see that this sort of system is the way forward, even if their emphasis is different.
Yes. I can think of other elements too. The Medicare itself being abolished and Medibank and Medicare coming back, and finally the Liberal Party coalition agreeing to it, and now it's become the settlement. In your book, you say that something like this happened right back at the beginning of Australian Federation, between the free marketers and the protectionists. A story that most of us would not have heard of, but they came also to a kind of settlement on the original Australian settlement.
Well, yes, it's easy for us. I mean, particularly now that everyone thinks free market. Well, maybe now things are changing, but until comparatively recently, at least when I was sort of growing up, I think free market economics was the accepted way of thinking and talking about these things. And now that, you know, since the 80s, that had been the way. Before the 1980s, that was not the way. But if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century and the period leading up to Federation and then the first decade of the Federation, the disputes were very different. The major divide in politics was between protectionists and the free traders, those who thought we should have tariffs that protected Australian industry from foreign competitors, and those who thought that, no, we shouldn't, we should have a free market. And this was the major division in colonial politics and leading up to Federation. Now,
it was between the states too. New South Wales was more free.
Yes.
The people in Victoria wanted tariff protection.
Victoria was the centre of protectionism. New South Wales, free trade. You know, the Constitution abolished protectionism between the states and said trade between the new states, previously the colonies, had to be free, and you couldn't put in place anything that protected trade within your state. But it didn't say anything about international trade, and that was left to the Commonwealth to decide what to do. And so in the beginning of the Commonwealth, this is a very big dispute, right? Because this was the fundamental disagreement that they had. And then we see this situation emerge where Deakin realises, for his own reasons, that his political career might benefit if he were able to sort of work with the protectionists. And bit by bit, everyone starts to find a reason to support protectionism. And it's not the case that everyone always thought protectionism was good. There were very strong arguments against it, but this ended up being a settlement because everyone could see something in it that worked for them, and they all had their own reasons for justifying something that many of them originally if you'd asked them to start from first principles, they would not have said this was a good idea at all. But in the circumstances, they saw that there was a way of making this work. And I mean, economically, it was clear from the beginning that it was not going to work, but it did survive for 80 years and it served the country well in its formative years. It was part of what gave the cohesion to the country that it needed. When it's easy for us now to think Australia was always going to be a successful country, but it may not have been. And this was part, this Australian settlement, of which protectionism was one of the key policies, was central to creating the context in which the country could have this.
Although I don't want to get into it today, although personally I would be interested, but I don't think for our viewers, the Church of England, from the time of the restoration of the monarchy, from Queen Elizabeth, I should say, till perhaps last century, was also in its own strange way competing reasons to do the same thing. It was also a settlement, and that's a very interesting, long, complicated version. Now, I want to come back to those two what you've mentioned, the one the Deaconite one and the one Howard and Howard Costello, Hawke, Keating. But you were also involved in something more recently, which you hope would become a settlement, and it's fizzed, and that is the recognition of Indigenous people in the Australian Constitution. Firstly, what was the problem what was the objective situation that threw up the need for some work on this, in your view?
Well,
Damien?
I think you've got to go back to the public conversation and the political project of reconciliation. Reconciliation had led, the discussion about that had led to a point in 2007 when John Howard, as Prime Minister, gave a speech to the Sydney Institute in which he said, if I'm re-elected, I'm committing to have a referendum on constitutional recognition of the Indigenous people, and he talked about why he thought that was necessary, and it was necessary as the next step in advancing the project of reconciliation, and yet he explained why he now was committed to that. And there's a whole history of what had happened, John Howard trying to deal with these issues and the difficulties he'd had, and the point that he got to that he thought this was important. At that point, Kevin Rudd was the opposition leader. He said Labor also was committed to this. So from that point on, we had a bipartisan political commitment that we needed to have constitutional recognition of the Indigenous people in order to advance the cause of recognition in the country. That left open the question, we're committed to amending the Constitution in some way, doing something that would in some sense recognise Indigenous people. Yeah. Right. It was still an open question what that would look like.
Why do you think that was right to be a settlement? What was it about that kind of problem you thought could also be dealt with in this settlement way?
So if you want to change the law in Australia, if you want to make it a change to an act of parliament, you need the government to say that it will be government policy, and the government either controls the Senate or it can persuade enough crossbenchers to support it, and it could get through. But we all know that constitutional reform in this country doesn't work like that. It's a requirement of the Constitution that if you want to amend it, after it's passed both houses of parliament, before it can receive the royal assent, it needs to be referred to the electors at a referendum, and it needs a majority, an overall majority plus a majority in 4 of the 6 states. So it's a very high level of support required, and it also requires the buy-in of people who don't normally engage in the business of lawmaking. I mean, let's be honest, ordinary people are electors, they vote in the members of parliament, and they think that they're sending people to parliament to make the laws, and then they find that the lawmakers are referring a matter back to them and saying, well, you need to decide about this. Well, this is not something that people normally feel comfortable doing, and I don't blame ordinary people that if the lawmakers, if they look at the the lawmakers, and the lawmakers can't agree about this, then I'm not surprised that people feel uncomfortable being asked to make a change that no one can actually agree whether this is a good change or not. So if you want the ordinary people to vote yes at a referendum, we need to have a very high level of agreement across the political class, across, there needs to be very clear that everyone is comfortable that this is a good idea, because if there's real disagreement, it's not reasonable that people can, so this is why if ever there was an issue that was going to need this kind of settlement, it's a change to the Constitution.
And the reason is because you could not, it'd be far too optimistic to think everybody would want it for the same reason.
So that's
from the same point
exactly.
of view.
So the next point is, if we're going to get everyone, if we're going to get the level of agreement that we need, we have to be honest and say, we're never going to get everyone on the same page. People aren't going, particularly when it comes to something like Indigenous affairs. These have questions to do with the history of Indigenous people and colonisation and how we understand these things. These things are always going to be fraught. There's going to be disagreement about, these questions of sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, all these sorts of issues. We're not going to get agreement about that, and it's not reasonable to expect that we're going to get agreement about that. So if we're going to have a solution to this, and both sides of Parliament have committed that we need to have a referendum to address it, it's going to have to be something like a settlement. It's going to have to be something that people coming at this in different ways can all look at it and see something that they can support, even if they've got different reasons for supporting it, even if they're... So this was why we thought there was a need for a settlement here. And, my early work, there's a chapter in the book explaining, was about trying to start a conversation that could lead to this sort of settlement.
And I won't give up away by saying, unfortunately, it doesn't work. Spoiler alert, it fails. I'll talk about the failure in a moment. This time you thought consciously of creating a settlement. The other two settlements we've talked about, and probably the Church of England one as well, am I right? No one consciously thought, let's do a settlement. It came about in an unintended result of the context that it was in. In fact, to admit it was a settlement may itself give the game away. We're going to do this for a different reason than others. In fact, you almost need to not realise you are doing it for different reasons for it to work.
Well,
whereas this time you're seriously trying to make it happen.
Well,
is that a fair insight?
I think you're getting at something that's a fair observation. I don't think we ever said publicly, we hereby call for a settlement.
No,
we never sort of, it was not something like that, but it was an awareness. So it was particularly an awareness on the part of Noel Pearson. So a little bit more of the context. Julia Gillard had become Prime Minister. She had established this expert panel that provided a report. The report recommended that the best way of having recognition of Indigenous people would include a racial non-discrimination clause. The constitutional conservatives vehemently opposed that and very quickly made that clear. And Noel Pearson was surprised about that, but he started to engage with Greg Craven to try and understand why. And it was that process of understanding why that led Noel to see if this thing was going to work, there had to be a way of doing it that was acceptable to conservatives. Tony Abbott was on track to become Prime Minister at that point, and the question was, Tony was committed to this. He'd said publicly he wanted to achieve constitutional recognition. Noel could see, well, if we're going to do this, we've got to put forward some kind of proposal that that's going to be acceptable to Tony's party, to
as
the
well as to those of
the people who were advocating on behalf of the Indigenous. Yes. And that was so. I mean, to say he wanted a settlement, I think that's a bit me. Yeah, looking back and interpreting what we were doing, but we were trying to say, how is it possible to accommodate these things? And I think I think these other historical examples I've talked about, I think there is an element of that.
And was it, Damien Freeman, was it possible, you think, from that starting point?
So I think my account of the history is divided into two parts. The work of what Noel Pearson called the Chancellery Group that met in the Vice-Chancellery at Australian Catholic University, and the private conversations we were having that led to an understanding of how it is that we might find this kind of compromise. That was the first stage, and I think that wasn't genuinely an exercise in trying to understand the concerns other people had and to find a settlement that addressed a range of different concerns and that people could advocate for in different ways that spoke to their different sets of concerns. Now, on my understanding of what we were doing, that work was always to lay the groundwork for some sort of public conversation. And as I say in the book, the public conversation never really got going in the right way. There was never this kind of, what I've described as settlement politics. We never saw that happen.
No, it turned into winner-take-all politics, as I understand.
Indeed. Well, or what I call polarised politics, yeah.
Because winner-take-all is, I'm going to get this through because I'm going to take it and give you nothing. Settlement politics is, I'm going to find some way to get this in a way that you'll go away not feeling that you got nothing out of it. We both get something, even if the thing we're getting out of this thing is slightly different from our different points of view. But that collapsed, and it collapsed. Why did it collapse? I've got a theory, actually. I'll tell you my theory in a minute.
Why did it collapse? Well, look, different people point to different moments in time at which it collapsed. I think over the last 10 years, there was increasingly less willingness to engage in this activity that I call settlement politics. I think the polarisation of public discourse increased, and I think people had less reason to want to try and talk to each other rather than to talk past each other. And I think this, now, I mean, in the end, it's very clear to me, in the end, the Prime Minister's responsible for this because he was the one who was determined to push ahead with this and to push ahead with it in a way that did not allow for the kind of conversation that might have found common ground. Yes. I believe it was possible to find common ground, but yet there had to be a willingness. I think in the end there was no willingness.
So it had to be this voice and this particular kind of voice and so forth. I've always been intrigued by the slogan used by the Yes campaign. You may remember it was Yes 23 in a kind of box with sort of pastel colours. And I thought, why 23? What's that? What on earth's that got to do with what we're trying to do? And my theory is, and I'm interested in your view, that we were misled by the plebiscite on same-sex marriage, right? Because there was another example of a disagreement, but this was a winner-takes-all result, and it looked like Australia had become, quote, more progressive. And I think, unwittingly, the reason why there was no settlement is that the people who wanted a particular recognition thought Australia has changed. We can win this like they won it in, whatever it was, this is Yes, again, the Yes 23 says, do what we did last time, only now do it in 1923. In 2023, I should say. And of course, fatally misreading the great differences between the two questions, both at the level of difficulty, but also what was being asked. So I felt this commonality between the two cases, which I think in this case was deeply misleading, because you don't need a settlement if you think you can wipe the floor with your opponent.
Yes.
Which they did, which the Yes case did with same-sex marriage. But what do you think?
Well, yes, I agree. You're not interested in a settlement if you think you can wipe the floor. It's only going to work when you think that actually it's going to be too difficult, too hard, take too long, the cost will be too great. So therefore, it's better. We've got reason to try and find a compromise we can all live with. I think I've certainly heard at the highest levels of government there was a belief that the country had changed, and then apparently a feeling that was a misjudgment and the country had not changed. But an acknowledgement, when I say there was a misjudgment, that I understand that they then said, well, obviously the country hadn't changed as much as we thought it had. I mean, so there was that, certainly I think in government circles at a high level, there was that amongst the Indigenous, the people leading this discussion. I think there was a feeling, there was that feeling, and they really just didn't. And I think you're right that the marriage debate led people to believe the country had changed. I think there was a misunderstanding that was a very different proposition. It was a very different proposition. Yeah.
Now, you called your book rather pessimistically, The End of Settlement. Do you mean never again?
Well, I say I like enigmatic titles of books. I like the title of a book to lead you to think, well, does he mean this or that? It's a good reason to read the book, perhaps. Or maybe that leads people to think he doesn't know what he's talking about, so I shouldn't read the book. But I think it's like, oh, well, it could mean this, it could mean that. That's a sort of an interesting thing. Do I think never again? No, I don't think that's the case. But I think a way of doing business in Australia that had lasted for the better part of a century appears to be breaking down. I think the referendum is clearly emblematic of the failure of settlement politics. Is it possible for us to restore? I mean, first of all, do you want to restore it? And my book is first of all to say to you, it'd be a good idea. It's got virtues. There's the reasons that this is a good thing. And then, well, these are going to be the challenges. And I think there are real challenges because the Edelman Trust Barometer points out that trust in public institutions is decreasing, is at the lowest levels in the 20 years I think that it's been going, and that polarisation is at an all-time high in Australia. Those sorts of trends say this is going to be much harder to have the kind of settlement that you could have in the past when the country was more cohesive.
I think also there needs to be a sense, A, there is a genuine problem, and B, we can't get a solution unless we're all somehow engaged with it. As we come to a conclusion, the great issue is just crying out for a settlement at the moment is climate change. That strikes me as a classic example. And now we have both sides committing themselves to something like no net carbon by 2050, but there's no sign of a settlement coming here. And the reason is that it seems to me neither side seems to think they need the other side to get what they want.
Well, yes, if you think, and I think as long as you think that, you'll keep.
That's right.
You'll fight to the death.
And who are the losers?
Well,
we are.
Yeah, this is going to be the unfortunate thing if it happens.
Well, on that happy note, I shouldn't be smiling. On that happy note, I want to thank you, Damian, for a most stimulating thesis. I think it's very illuminating, and although in the short term we're being pessimistic, I think in the long term it does suggest there are ways forward in what at the face of it look intractable problems, but can be solved by going into a settlement. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
I'm Rob Forsyth. This was Liberalism in Question, another one of the podcasts here from the Centre for Independent Studies. Thank you for joining us.